Telecom operators are under increasing pressure to transform their networks, improve subscriber experience, and create new opportunities with open technologies and advancements like 5G, Edge, and IoT. But to roll out these services while reducing costs, automation is no longer a nice to have, it's a requirement. As components become virtualized and containerized, software becomes the foundation of this distributed telco cloud while simultaneously forcing a reevaluation of core networking services, strategies, product requirements surrounding core network services, DNS, DHCP, and IP address management, or what is also called DDI. So for today, we wanted to focus on automation. Infoblox is a Red Hat partner, and with the automation capabilities that Red Hat Automation Platform can provide operators, I thought it'd be a really good idea to involve them in this series. So joining us today is George James, Senior Partner Solutions Architect, Infrastructure Ecosystem Development. George, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
David, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So George, first of all, I don't really usually roll out such a major red carpet here, but obviously you work at Red Hat, but you have a really interesting and rich background in networking and IT. And last week I was pulling up some of your background on LinkedIn. We've been working with each other since really late 2019, but a couple of things popped out for me that you worked with Infoblox in your past life as a network engineer. So you've been in the trenches. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
So yeah, I worked before coming to Red Hat in 2019. I worked for a large managed services provider out of Irvine. And we dealt mostly with large financial institutions, banks, title companies, things like that. So they had a lot of remote offices. And so I was involved with large IP spaces across many, many sites. And I actually was at the company long enough to watch us go from spreadsheets to another IPAM, IP administration tool, and then converting that into Infoblox. And then ended up managing the IP space for one of our large clients in Infoblox.
Wow. So yeah, and you nailed it on the whole spreadsheet part because of course my main focus is on the larger telcos. So in my mind, if you take what even some of the largest global multinationals are doing, and then take that and extrapolate that to a telecommunications operator, it's like times 100, some of the struggles that they're going through. So I've got to believe that you really lived through the pain, in the network engineering space. And I think we've all been there. Manual processes, multiple handoffs involving IP address provisioning and other common network functions. I mean, for me, when I used to be a product manager at a telco, and I remember we were rolling out a cloud product, we were just about to launch. I mean, we were right there. And then all of a sudden we realized the program manager never asked for the IPs.
Yeah.
And actually held up a lot of the progress. So, without that automation, the speed and agility that organizations hope to be able to gain from the cloud, it just, make it impossible to provision cloud services quickly.
Yeah.
So while orchestration, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say at that scale, yes, automation is vital. Even as great as Infoblox was for us and made our life so much easier, it was still a manual process for someone to enter, a request ticket for a new IP space because every office had its own subnet. And then for someone to go in and manually make sure it was in the right region, make sure it was the right size, assign, different hosts, etc. All that was a manual process. And then, of course, when you decommission the site, you have the reverse. Did somebody go in and release the IP space? Is the IP space already in use? Did somebody check the network table to make sure it's not, already there? All that was a manual process. It took a lot of time, and there were often mistakes.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things is that, even in spite of all that, and people are either moving into the cloud, they're tiptoeing into the cloud, they're tiptoeing into a sort of a hybrid structure. These orchestration systems, these orchestration platforms can spin up multiple virtualized instances, thousands of virtualized instances in minutes, but it might take hours, days, or even longer to provision the IP address and the DNS records, much less pull it back. once these things are deprovisioned. So absolutely. So your passion now obviously is automation, and I think you even embraced Red Hat Ansible automation platform, or I think probably back in the old days it was called Ansible Tower, in your past life as a network engineer, and you really led the charge on promoting Ansible and automation across your organization. So for those that may not necessarily be aware, that are watching right now, if you can maybe just break it down real simply of what is Red Hat Ansible automation platform, what does it do, and how can people really start to employ this?
Yeah. So I did want to just give a little bit of background on my old job. And yeah, so as I mentioned, we had a lot of sites that we had to automate. So all routers, switches, all these configs, and we did have standardized configs, but we didn't really have a way of automatically deploying things out to the network. So as towards the end of my career there, I really wanted to find a way to automate our more mundane tasks. And me and a couple of other engineers really gravitated around Ansible and its network automation. It doesn't have an agent, so there's nothing to install on that end device. And that was like a really big seller for us. So at the time, I just really got into Ansible, and I felt like it was just the future for networking. And luckily I was able to go over to Red Hat and pursue that. So what is Red Hat Ansible automation platform? So as I mentioned, there's Ansible, there's our Ansible core, which is our public open source project that you can download onto your laptop or your Linux server, and you can just start automating today with the command line. But when you at enterprise scale, you need a way to manage those playbooks, to manage those teams across your entire IT footprint. So not just network automation, but your storage allocation, your new servers. So you might have a new server deployment for a web server. So you may need an IP address assigned. So we want to do that automatically. You might need a firewall port opened. You might need a load balancer configured. And then you need the web server actually installed. You need the server operating system updated. You need a security patch done. And Ansible can do that across your entire IT footprint. And what's nice about Ansible automation platform is we take that core engine and we build upon it with the tools that an enterprise needs. So an enterprise needs role-based access control. So they need a way to make sure to know who's running what playbooks and when. So they need that centralized logging. They may have a bunch of different DMZs. So this was a problem we had at my old job, is that we had these different DMZs that we managed, these different networks. So we couldn't just have one centralized Ansible control node that would go out across all these different DMZs and automate different devices. We would have to install, separate and manage separate devices in each domain. So the main components are going to be your automation controller. That's going to give you your role-based access control and your scheduling. And that's going to allow operators to go in and deploy playbooks that they may not have necessarily written, but then they can add through variables the information that might be needed to deploy a new system. We also have Automation Hub, which is a centralized repository of certified content that Red Hat supports with our partners. We also have extra analytics and logging with the automation platform. So think of it as enterprise grade. It's automation at scale for the enterprise.
Okay, very good. And if we expand a little bit on Ansible automation platform, because we've got a lot of people who are programmers, right? They go way back there, and they might be thinking to themselves, I could just get an Ansible Galaxy and download some of the code that I want. But then, there's also that notion of a certification, automation certification. Maybe sort of explain why that's so important in this sense.
Sure. So, open source is awesome. Red Hat is built on open source, but at the same time, you want to have a company standing behind the software that you run. So Ansible Galaxy is our open source repository for Ansible modules. So a module is just a piece of code that will do a specific thing against a certain system. So in Infoblox's case, we have NIOS, your IP administration tool. So we have a module, which is just a piece of code that goes out and deploys or changes a certain aspect on a certain system. So in the case of NIOS, it might assign a new IP, or it might create a new DNS record for us. So those modules can then be certified by our partners. So in Infoblox's case, we have a certified collection of modules that goes into Automation Hub. So some of that content is duplicated on Ansible Galaxy, but Ansible Galaxy also has a lot of community contributed modules that may not necessarily work correctly in your enterprise. So you want to make sure that at enterprise scale, you're using modules that are supported by both Red Hat and our partners.
So taking this back a little bit more into the telco network operator perspective. So in today's telco cloud environment, and I think that's sort of a new phrase to describe how telcos are actually reinventing their networks. It's not just this static structure that was residing, inside a single network, inside a single set of core data centers that they've operated in for so long. We're talking about distributed computing, maybe some using public cloud, as you've seen out there. New devices, VMs, containers, and hosts are joining and leaving the network all the time. If administrators and DevOps, NetOps can see all the devices in one place and automate this cumbersome process that we've talked about of assigning and retracting IPs to devices and things that are going to enter and leave the network, it's obviously going to significantly reduce that time to deployment and the ongoing maintenance. And of course, that's when I think over the years, we've been working closely with Red Hat to develop that Infoblox NIOS collection for Ansible, which we're providing that centralized and that automated way to manage not just DNS, but DHCP and IP address management, which we call DDI, across these multiple platforms. And that's when I first started working with you, of course. And I came across this blog that another person on your team had written, but it was sort of the aha moment for me. It was like, oh my gosh, someone gets this out there. And it referenced Infoblox and how Ansible users could use Infoblox as what they're calling this dynamic inventory, or this source of truth, for the platform. You've been a huge proponent of ours. Maybe you can help explain why this is important, not just for those enterprises, but for the telecom operators. And I say that's because one of the things you mentioned before was talking about, deploying all of these workloads, deploying these containers in this large part. One of the things that almost pops in my mind is a football match, right? Especially in Europe. You still got World Cup going on. I'm thinking to myself, all these people are showing up there. They're taking pictures. They're uploading them to their social media apps. All those IPs have to be put out there. It's just massive. Maybe you can sort of give your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So as workloads move to the edge, so this could be on a phone, as you mentioned. So there might be like a ticketing system, pushed to the edge, or even edge IoT devices, like in manufacturing. You might have a lot of sensors or some robotic arms or cameras that do some type of detection. Maybe they're looking at a finished product to see if there's any defects in it. Well, all of those are going to need IP addresses, obviously, but they're also going to need some type of config management. They're going to need some type of local intelligence or computing that's going to control that, and all of that can be automated through Ansible.
Yeah.
So when you have all of these hundreds or thousands of devices, there's no way to do this manually. I saw this at my old job, and we were managing, I think, like 1,200 sites. And you can imagine 1,200 sites with, a router and 3 switches each, in varying levels of complexity. And that was a full-time job for a good number of people. With automation, it was really the only way I saw forward to manage this as our business grew and grew, and we wanted to manage more devices. Basically you have to do more with less, and automation is the key for that. So at scale, you need automation. So Red Hat gives you the ability to automate that at the edge. And then Red Hat OpenShift gives you the ability to move those workloads from your bare metal servers out to your data centers, and then move that same workload into a private cloud, to a public cloud, and then even out to the edge. It's still going to be the same application running everywhere.
Ansible Fest 2022, in person, thank goodness. It was just in Chicago this past October. I think
I
for
was
the
not able
third,
to go.
you weren't able to go, but it was fantastic. Love the show. Love the venue. We were a gold sponsor, I think, for the third year in a row, which was awesome. We had great turnout at our booth. Many of our customers, joint customers, popped over to see us. And it was, for me, great to be there to see that so many of them were actually using the Infoblox NIOS collection for Ansible in either full production. I think a great number of them were actually finding use cases that they could actually try out. It almost seemed like some of them were saying, "Hey, we're going to try maybe on one use case, get this into production, build up the confidence, realize success, and then expand and do something else there." So along those lines, maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the use cases that network operators might be able to easily tackle using Red Hat Ansible automation.
So you mentioned somebody starting with a small use case, and that's usually what I recommend people is like find a pain point that is causing you a lot of manual labor and automate it. So I hope people don't mind me telling this example, but we at my old job we had a bunch of sites in Florida, and there was a storm coming in. So the people in Florida are like, "Hey, we want every router config saved. We want every switch config saved." So my old method was go get a spreadsheet, break it down into groups, assign it out to 10 engineers, let them go log into a router and a switch manually and back up the config. With Ansible, it took me about an hour to write the script because I wasn't very good at Ansible at the time. And it took me another hour to test and another hour to run it. I was done one person like 2 or 3 hours. So I was able to take this pain point, this really like labor intensive thing that we had to do and get one engineer to get it done in a couple hours. Start with that. So pick that pain point and then build out from there. So as you build out, you're going to create this library of content for yourself that you're going to be able to automate more and more against. So you're going to be able to back up your configs automatically. You're going to be able to push config changes. And not only that, but your network infrastructure, your variables. So Ansible has this concept of variables where you define all your variable settings in a config in a file, and then you can push that to something like GitHub for a source of truth or Bitbucket, and then that becomes your source of truth for your network. So your config blows up, you can just rebuild it from scratch. That becomes kind of like a dynamic documentation for your network. Or think of something like an auditor coming in and saying, "Hey, we want to make sure you're updating your password every 30 days, 60 days. Now you can show them an Ansible playbook that does it for you, and you're done. You want to maybe validate the current state of the network. So you want to look at your IP tables. Your IP route tables. You want to make sure that everything's in the way that it's supposed to be.
Yeah,
kind of like a desired state engine, or network compliance, like I mentioned, security. So your security team brings in some new policies, and you can now actually make policy as code and make sure that those policies are being enforced on your network. Not to mention IP address management. As I mentioned earlier, we would manually go into Infoblox and reserve subnets, create hosts, whatever. Now I can just have that part of my automated workflow whenever I commission or decommission a network device.
And I know that there were two, one earlier use case, and then there was one use case specifically that you actually wrote a blog about last year when we, I think, updated our code on the NIOS collection. They were both DNS related, but I know the one that we sort of highlighted ourselves was for operators who were using our DNS caching server, DNS cache acceleration.
It was
to be able to detect. Oh, go ahead.
It was DTC.
Yeah. DNS traffic control, which is sort of like a global load balancing application. And we had one of the earlier use cases. I think the simple one was to say, hey, let's detect when the cache hit ratios on the DNS servers fall below a certain threshold. Instead of having to have a DNS operations person, manually watching this all the time, or get an alert, to just all of a sudden have Ansible just start deploying additional DNS caching servers, right? Be able to take that load, and then once the event was actually over, to start ratcheting down the number of caching instances that were actually out there. So I thought it was cool. I wanted to pause and provide a bit more context on this important use case. One of our joint telecommunications provider customers required the ability to launch DNS servers in a fully automated fashion. DNS caching infrastructure needs to be as robust as possible to provide the fastest responses to subscribers. We work closely with Red Hat to develop a DNS cache polling scheme to look at a load on a particular group of DNS servers. As the load on that group of servers increased, we leveraged Ansible to autoscale their DNS caching capabilities. To create new virtual machines on OpenStack, add them to the Infoblox grid, join these virtual machines into the Anycast group, allocate IP addresses, and many other things, and effectively do that without any human interaction. When the load condition discontinued, we reversed the process, automatically deprovisioning the DNS caching servers and reallocating the IP addresses back into the pool. And so this was an excellent telecom use case to provide services and scale them completely on demand. And what's nice about this use case was that we satisfy the automation requirements for a customer running virtualized servers, not containers, making this a great example where even with 4G standards on a 4G network, Infoblox and Red Hat Ansible automation platform can offer a fully automated solution to meet providers' needs regardless of where they are in their network evolution. But the DNS traffic control, anything in particular that was sort of interesting about that for you?
So DNS is kind of low in that network stack. It happens very early on in the conversations. So I really like the idea of improving that responsiveness, and DNS traffic controller helps to do that. So if you have distributed servers, in Australia, in Singapore, in North America, you can detect or direct traffic to the closest server. You can also have, multiple servers, and maybe one goes down, so you direct DNS to the next server over. With Ansible, you're able to create a documentation as code that then would go and set up your DNS traffic controller automatically for you. And then there's one other third use case, and I'm not a security person, but I thought that this is a really cool use case that we actually highlighted. I think it was about a year and a half ago. We did a Bright Talk webinar that we actually put on the Red Hat platform, and I can pop the link up on the screen here in a little bit. Okay. But we even show the way that we could use Ansible to automate security events that we would detect. So if we saw a certain condition, to be able to, let's say, block a DNS query from actually happening, and then notify third-party security solutions, say, hey, we detected something on the DNS layer, we stopped it. By the way, now you should actually go and investigate this thing. So it's just, I think the possibilities are sort of endless out there in terms of what operators are going to be able to do with this. So yeah, we just announced event-driven Ansible. So this is pretty much what you described. So some security event happens, and then we have a playbook that kicks off and does whatever logging or remediation that may need to be done. So that's very good. Yeah, it's making Ansible more proactive and not just well, I meant less reactive, more like more proactive. What's a good way to say that? Yeah. I think I got it the first time, but okay, all right. Yeah. So, well, very good. Yeah, and I think on that security angle as well, I did a small roadshow with about 3 CISO events across the Midwest earlier this summer, and every single venue, they all said, man, if there was a way that there was a tool that actually gave me back more time in my day,
that's the security tool for me. And it's funny. It's just Ansible's actually can sort of help become that security tool just from the event-driven perspective of that, to be able to interact with these other tools and actually do something based on a particular situation that it sees. So well, very good.
We can see security as code, we can see policy as code, infrastructure as code, and then networking as code, and then just everything is code, right? So automate your entire IT footprint across, from network up the stack to your server, and it's all going to help just glue all that together for you.
Well, very good. Well, hey, George, I really appreciate your time here. Thank you very much for the discussion and the continued help with the partnership that we've been building for the last couple of years. So really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
And for those of us who are sort of interested in maybe some of the other things that we've talked about, I'm definitely going to pop up a link towards the end of the video that will show some of the resources that we were talking about. Definitely the webinar that was talking or referencing the security or the event-driven situations that you can use Ansible with the existing NIOS collection to be able to handle some of these situations, but also some resources in terms of where you can find the NIOS collection for Ansible and other resources out there that you can use. So again, George, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And everyone, thank you for watching.